Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and adaptive decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, to make research applied and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Daniel Cooper. Daniel is a human performance specialist who focuses on improving individual and team performance in high-pressure, high-consequence situations for first responders and tactical operators. Daniel is currently completing a 3-year PhD research project involving investigating the impacts of pressure and evidence-based training methodologies in use of force behaviors to improve the transfer of training to performance. Daniel has built on his previous academic understanding from a double master's degree in physiology and integrated cognitive factors, and complements this through his unique experience from 18 years service with the Special Air Service, high performance coaching in professional sports, and personal pursuits in conquering the world's toughest extreme endurance events across the planet's most unforgiving environments. Well, Dan, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thank you for making the time to talk to us today.
Yeah, hi, Chris. My pleasure, and thanks for having me on the show. I've listened to a number of the episodes and really enjoy some of the content that's coming out. So it's an absolute pleasure to be on here.
Awesome. Well, it's our pleasure to have you, and I was excited to reach out and connect with you. I got exposed to this paper that you and some colleagues published, and I thought it was a very topical issue that we should be discussing on the Trainer's Bullpen in relation to officer performance in the rapidly unfolding high consequence events that they face on the street. And specifically, of course, we're going to be talking about the relationship of pressure on marksmanship. And that was the title of your paper, Dan. It was called Negative Consequences of Pressure on Marksmanship May Be Offset by Early Training Exposure to Contextually Relevant Threat Training, a systematic review and meta-analysis. And this was published in Human Factors in March of 2023. And as a reminder to all our listeners, if you go to thetrainersbullpen.com, you'll be able to access a copy of this paper, and I strongly encourage you to download it, review it, make notes, digest it as you listen along with this podcast. So, Dan, why don't we start at the very beginning, which is I'd like to know what led you to explore this particular issue of the relationship of pressure on marksmanship.
So if we go back, so I think we'll go too far back. But I did a lot of military deployments or combat deployments overseas with Australian Special Operations. And we'd gone through a phase where we had upskilled, or we changed the way we did our training based on just the way we were performing and some of the observations we were making in combat, that the training we were doing previously just wasn't preparing us for combat operations, because we've been heavily sort of like 80s and 90s counterterrorism or domestic sort of counterterrorism. And all of a sudden we're thrust into this urban environment. So went through a process of improving our training. Our skill within the training environment improved rapidly. But then a lot of the behaviors I was seeing in combat still, to me, indicated that something was missing. There was a piece of this puzzle that was missing. And I'd been going through and doing work in the sort of strength and conditioning physiological environment and looking at performance and then some of the stuff around selection. There were still pieces of the puzzle that I was more curious about what was going on in a more broader sort of holistic context. And then I got interested in the sort of mental side of things and how people perform under pressure. And some of that came from choking in sport initially. And that led into the PhD, which was looking at what is the next evolution in the way we do our training to try and improve the outcomes that we're seeing overseas in these high consequence, high threat environments. I got an opportunity to do a scholarship with the PhD. And then, although the initial phase was going to be different because of COVID, it changed some of our research plans, and then ended up doing this meta-analysis. But it gave me a really good understanding of the current state of play within use of force And then that actually set up a really good baseline to then go and do some of the more applied research that I went on with, sort of thing. So the meta-analysis I was actually quite happy with. And some of the interesting things around that was just the lack of research that was available, sort of thing. So there's a couple of great researchers that feature heavily throughout that article. And my analysis pretty much is just on the back of the work they did. So full credit to them. But it was a real paucity in the research available. And that was picked up through the review process, was that, just the lack of available evidence in an area that is so important and has such huge consequences if we underprepare people.
Right on. So just want to touch on something you mentioned there, Dan. You said that you had observed a lack of transfer from the training environment to the operational environment. And when you witnessed that personally firsthand, was it just marksmanship failure, degradation that you saw, or was it, like, when you talk about transfer, was there multiple areas where performance failed to transfer?
On the marksmanship side, it'd be more difficult to really ascertain because this is military combat. So you've got so many factors about light, or sort of light, low light, speed. You've got night vision sort of factor. So using sort of the night vision equipment that we have, you've got people like undercover. So there's so many other factors. The marksmanship would be really hard to really determine whether that had degraded or not. Theoretically, you would say it would, but it was more so around just a lot of the behaviors and the decision-making processes, but even to the point of people's ability to take in information. So communication degraded. And a lot of this was initial exposure. And then, as most people that have been involved in these environments would sort of be able to talk about, is that the more you're exposed to it, the more sort of comfortable, I suppose. It's probably kind of a loose term for it. So the more familiar you get with it, so the more you're able to sort of maintain normal function. But sort of a lot of the observations that I'd seen, and we'd spoken a lot about in our training, is developing pre-combat veterans, was that there was still some way to go to bridge that gap from training to performance in high consequence environment. And because of the level of threat you're working under, you're never really going to get there, but you want to reduce the gap so you've got better outcomes initially. And then the more people are exposed to it, the better their performance, until they're sort of regulating their emotional response and they're performing at sort of that higher level you would expect. So that's kind of the observations I was making. And there was always an individual variability in the way people performed initially and their sort of learning curve to get to the point that they needed to be at. And some people just didn't quite bridge that gap. They just got there and it just wasn't for them.
Now, when you said that you often in range training, or in the static type of training, that you saw rapid performance improvements, is it so why does that fail to transfer, Dan? What is it? Is it just is it an inability to emotionally regulate? Is it an increase in cognitive load? Is it all of those things? Or I know we're going to get into it more as we go through your paper, but can you give us in a nutshell, like, what are the contributors to these serious degradations in performance from the training environment to the operational environment?
Yeah, I think it's multifactorial. So a really big piece, I think, is the ability to self-regulate under that level of increased threat. And I use the term threat mostly because it's just the research that I've done, but you could replace that with pressure or stress. But for me, it's just a threat response based on a physical threat or even a potential threat in your future. So it's the ability to maintain that threat response. And then you look at the sort of the inverted U, or the catastrophe theory model of regulation. At some point, once you breach your threshold to you breach your capacity for that threat, is that performance degrades very rapidly. And then you get these changes in cognitive function based off that increase in motion, where you start to attend to different information. You're perceiving that information differently, you're processing it differently, and then that sort of perception action process has changed. And on the back of that is the execution of a motor skill, which is now degraded as well. So when you're looking at the way a lot of people do their training, it's sort of, we'll go and do a lot of range-based training where there's no relevant visual information, there's no contextually relevant threat, there's sort of, it's very static in a sort of a sterile environment, and we're just learning marksmanship skills or sports shooting, you could say, around timing, sort of steel targets, paper targets, photosynthetic targets, these sort of things. So there's a real lack of contextually relevant information or fidelity in that training environment. And I think all these factors are probably what's contributing to that sort of underperformance in a situation where people become very survival based.
Right. Okay. So I'd like to unpack something that you mentioned. You briefly threw in the term Yerkes-Dodson and the catastrophe model. And I think just for the benefit of all of our listeners, Daniel, that may not be overly familiar with what is Yerkes-Dodson and the catastrophe model. Maybe can you just explain that relationship between physiological arousal and performance?
Yeah, so I'm not a specialist in these sort of either of those theories, but sort of a simple understanding is that Yerkes-Dodson is an inverted U theory or bell-shaped curve, where as arousal goes up, performance improves with it to a certain zone where people will perform optimally. And then once arousal goes beyond that, then performance starts to decrease. The catastrophe theory is a similar sort of curve, but instead of a sort of exponential decrease or the other side of that bell curve, it's just a straight cliff almost, where you get to a certain point and performance just stops, almost like people freeze or they have an inability to function. And then the threat or stress that they're under has to be reduced to a level where they can then maintain or get back to performance, and then it's increased from that point on. But in a use of force or in a combat situation, you can't decrease that threat. Like once they hit that set point and they freeze or they're unable to function, then everyone around them has that sort of duty of care to then take care of them and make sure that they get through that situation or they survive that situation. So there's just kind of the relationship between pressure and performance. At some point, you breach your capacity and performance declines.
Right. Okay. And I'm interested in your experience on that. For years, I have heard the term, especially with law enforcement trainers that are very into the research and the physiology and kinesiology and of human performance. As Yerkes-Dodson is something that's not completely uncommon, but I think the newer model that I've heard in the recent years that you're talking about, the catastrophe model. And when I reflect on my experience on the street as a police officer, when I've seen officers go into that state that you're talking about, that hypervigilance, the code black, whatever you want to call it, is I have not observed the Yerkes-Dodson slow degradation. It's almost as if the officers step off a cliff and it's a precipitous drop. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Your experience, would you say in an operational life-threatening environment like that you have operated in, that the catastrophe model is more of an accurate depiction, or have you seen slow decreases in performance?
No, I tend to agree that it's more a catastrophic failure almost. People get to a point and then function just stops. Like they can't take in information, they're not hearing things, or the visual information they're attending to completely changes. And a lot of the research that I looked at from defensive-based survival models or defensive-based models sort of aligns with that a little bit. And this is kind of me theorizing and joining some dots here, is that once they get to that point where they're no longer, or it breaches their capacity for that threat. And this is where I think the contextually relevant threat becomes really important, because the more they're exposed to it, the higher that capacity becomes. So they've built a tolerance. So once they breach that, then it's almost like they go into a survival-based defensive behavior mode, or they become about survival. So now it's about early identification of threat, early avoidance. And this is where now they're just fixated on trying to identify what the threat is and how they move away from it. So they lose a lot of that ability to look at the task relevant information, to sort of shift back or shift away from threat back to task with their information processing. So they sort of get that cognitive tunneling where their situational awareness decreases. So they're not attending to communications, non-verbal information or communication is not being attended to. They're sort of not seeing things that they should be seeing to inform response. And they kind of just either go into that sort of freeze or flight or kind of survival-based explosive defensive behavior. And that kind of differs. And you could look at a whole heap of videos and hypothesize that that's what you're seeing in certain videos, but I think it's very difficult to ever truly understand what's going on inside an individual's mind. But to me, it definitely is more aligned to the catastrophe theory than that gradual decrease where performance degrades sort of slowly. So yeah, I tend to agree. And I think context has a little bit to do with it. So, lower threat, some people may get more of a gradual decline, but into high threat, I think it's just they become about avoidance and survival.
Right. Okay. And now I like your phrase, cognitive tunneling. And do you think that, so when we look at a loss of adaptability, which is what you were also referring to there, where they're no longer focused on the changing environment, being able to adapt, to make good decisions. So when they get in that cognitive tunnel, if they've fallen off the stress arousal curve, is there a way that, like, if that's me and I find myself in that loss of emotional regulation, is that it for me? Or are there ways, are there skills that we can teach officers that in your experience would enable them when they find themselves, I guess two parts to this question. Can we teach performers to recognize when they're starting to lose emotional regulation? That's question number one, I guess. And then number two is, do you think there are strategies that are helpful and effective at the individual level to pull me back out of that state and get me functional and adaptive again?
Yeah, definitely. So the first one I think is around exposure. So to be able to regulate, you have to expose yourself to contextually relevant threat. And this is where you see a lot of training that uses stress rather than threat. And when I say, or fatigue even, so I'll kind of just define the terms that I'm using there for the way I'm going to convey it. So fatigue is, push-ups, running around, these sort of things. And that's just physical fatigue to get the heart rate up, but it's unrelated to threat. If you have a job where you're performing under threat in a fatigued condition, then it could be contextually relevant. But just for the sake of trying to put people under pressure, fatigue's probably not a great tool. And then stress, in the way that I use that, is instructors yelling abuse or trying to put people under that pressure. But that's more of an internal based kind of threat to self, almost, that self-perception type of thing, not looking bad, not sort of underperforming, these sort of things. So it's not quite relevant to a physical threat they're going to see in their performance environment. And then you've got the actual contextually relevant threat, which is kind of your reality-based training, the non-lethal rounds, sort of shoot back cannons, shot vests, these sort of things that you can use that have a consequence based on the performance environment. So exposure to that, and then working through it. And this is where it becomes difficult, because everyone that turns up to an organization brings a different capacity to them. So you'll have people where, they might have grown up and they've been in a lot of fist fights or punch ups on the street. So for them, going hands-on's fine. They're comfortable with that. Then there's people that have come from other environments where they haven't done any of this. So their capacity is much lower. So giving an individually appropriate, contextually relevant threat and then progressing it appropriate to their level of adaptability takes a lot of resources and a lot of time. So there are limitations within the training environment with it. But if you can put that threat in front of them, get them to understand their response or become aware of that response, and then be able to regulate it, and then just progress it at their ability to improve. Like, you can build that capacity that way. But like I said, it's resource intensive, but you've got to weigh up what you do in the training environment is going to improve what you see in the performance environment. So it's going to cost you somewhere, either in decreased or inappropriate performance or in your training environment. And then the second side of that is, I haven't done a lot of specific research into the tools, but I know there's a number of tools out there that sort of talk around, so there's a visual system, being able to try and relax that a little bit. There's breathing protocols out there. And I know you've had a couple of great guests on there talking about those. And there's a few different ways to try and improve individual regulation. But then I think there's also some research out there, or indications, that providing extra resources to people can bring down that level of threat response. So if you've got somebody who's working with a highly experienced officer, and that officer, just their presence, like if they increase their presence or their communication, that can start to improve the outcome. So a lot of times people are predicting their ability to solve that problem based on the resources that they have, their perceived level of confidence or their confidence in their ability, these sort of things. But as soon as you up resource that, then their prediction changes. All of a sudden, this problem can be solved. So now their level of emotion decreases because the threat changes, or the threat is lowered because there's extra people here. So it's multifactorial. Some you can control, some you can't control, I think. So, but the more tools you give a person, the more exposure you give them, then the better the chances of them performing appropriately or performing sort of more optimally in the environment is going to improve, sort of thing. So, like I said, it's multifactorial. And I think the way a lot of training is going, we're kind of moving away from it, unfortunately, with some of the recruitment, with some of the training, the time constraints within training, these sort of things.
Okay. Could we talk a little bit about stress then, back to that? Because I was interested in how you coupled a term to stress, and you used the word abusive. And I think maybe we need to unpack that a little bit more, because we do hear trainers a lot talking about this idea of stress and stress inoculation in training, and the importance of. And so when you see that type of I guess, condition in a police academy, where the instructors are yelling at the recruits and putting them under a high degree of stress. And is there a role for that? Like, can that ever be productive in a learning environment, when we want people to learn to be adaptive problem solvers and learn good skills? Is there even such a thing as stress inoculation?
It's probably, I don't know, I'll talk about it a little bit, but it's kind of, some things, maybe there's a place for it at some point somewhere. So I'm not going to completely discount it. I think it's well overused, and to a point where it's having a negative impact. So my early training within special operations, it was still a verbally abusive environment, with, like, we do a lot of running, we do a lot of physical activity, we did a lot of work with sort of torsion bars, which were I think it's 15 kilos, so maybe 20, 25 pounds, I think would be the conversion. To the point where we couldn't really use our arms that well. And then we do an hour of weapon handling, and then we go shoot. So we turn up to the range, barely use our arms, couldn't hold weapons steady. And with a pistol, that becomes really important. And then we just be getting yelled at because we weren't very good shots. And the feedback we were getting it wasn't effective. It was just kind of a couple of key phrases that they'd always used. So we'd have all this stress, and now we're shooting at paper. Like, there's no information for us to actually synthesize to improve our performance. Within a training environment, yeah, we became resilient and kind of inoculated to that abusive environment. But then when we went overseas, none of us were actually prepared, and we'd had no skills. Like, we could shoot okay on a range, but that was it. So for me, it was almost zero transfer. And it's a very easy way to apply stress, but I don't think it's effective. If you're working within a policing environment, and I've never been policing, so this is kind of just trying to give a little bit of context, where you do have a verbally abusive crowd around you, or these sort of things, maybe implementing that into your training environment may be effective, because that's, as that crowd closes in and gets more abusive, the threat, or the perceived threat of that, will increase, because we don't like things in proximity to us, because it cuts down our reaction time. So I think our ability to respond, or the time gap to response. So I can understand how it may be used, but I think using it in learning is definitely suboptimal. You're just not going to get the outcomes that you want. So, and as far as the stress inoculation, it is kind of a term I used to use, but now I sort of talk more around exposure to build the capacity to deal with that threat. And like most capacities, it will be built around the context that it's in, or within the threat that is provided, with a little bit of crossover. But exposing them to one type of threat isn't going to make them comfortable with another type of threat necessarily. So the difference between, you could do a lot of work in reality-based training with edged weapons, but that's not going to make them comfortable in other environments that they're going to go into necessarily. So you need that really good diverse range of exposures, because you're kind of building all these experiences for them to then work off later on when they're performing, because we use experience to try and predict, or sorry, perceive and predict what's happening and how we're going to solve that problem. So it's sort of, I don't know, like if being abused is something that you're going to encounter, then maybe there is a place for it, but definitely not in the learning if you're going into an actual environment where it's just irrelevant.
Right. Okay. So I guess is one of the keys then as a trainer, the whatever the representativeness or the, like you said, the contextual relevance that I'm bringing into my training, I need to have an actual learning objective for it, right? I need to have a learning purpose. So is that where trainers would want to make sure whatever I'm bringing into that, like the pressure that you spoke about. So I'm bringing pressure into training and having them perform under that pressure, but it always needs to be tied to there needs to be a nexus to the real world, and in what am I adding and why am I adding it? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, definitely. So you got to try and understand the threats that they're going to face, and how do you replicate that safely within the environment that you have, with what you have access to within the time you have, type of thing. So like a lot of work does come back to the instructors, and the more work they do, obviously the less work the performer is going to have to do later to try and recreate that environment. And then I think there's almost a need as well to kind of have options to destabilize that environment once they can respond. And again, you don't want to breach their capacity to deal with that destabilization, because then you'll condition them for fear within your training environment. You always want them to be able to adapt and solve that problem, but you can teach them to sort of almost become, or have problem solving as a behavior. The more you destabilize it, then they can start to then, okay, well, what information do I need to look at now? What are my options now? If I do this, what's that going to happen, type of thing. So you kind of building that flexibility and almost an adaptive process in them.
Okay. So destabilization, just to make sure, that's a new phrase for me, but I think if I understand what you're mentioning there, Dan, is that so we want, as we add on those pressures, we scaffold them on. We want, is the idea is we want to constantly push our learners into that bandwidth. And I think it was Robert Bjork talks about desirable difficulties in learning, like never being in a zone of comfort, always being in a zone of discomfort. Would that be what you mean by destabilize, where you have to adapt and overcome?
Yeah. It's almost as they've found their solution, they're going through it, you change the problem a little bit. And then kind of, if they're not picking it up, then you can obviously intervene a little bit with some cues, or sort of some open-ended questions type of thing, or help them out a little bit. And one of the things with that sort of desirable difficulty is there are a lot of indications that at the right amount of stress response or threat response, we're performing a lot better. So some of the changes that take place under stress improve our sort of attention. They improve cognitive function. They improve the accuracy for us to identify information. They improve our endurance. There's a whole heap of changes that take place. And they also improve our learning and the way we consolidate those memories, or we code those memories. So you don't want a completely stress-free training environment. You want the right amount of pressure or stress so that it can improve the learning. And there's a whole heap of other sort of learning factors associated with it that sort of sat on the fringe of what I looked at. They weren't entirely within my research, but it sort of indicated that you want the right amount of stress. And then once they become comfortable, you want to increase it a little bit as well, because one of the other things that sort of became apparent was that people learn to game the training environment. So they learn the rules of training, and that's what they perform within, because they're after the training outcome, not the transfer to real world performance. So if they are become too comfortable, then throwing in something that they weren't expecting. And in the military over here, we call them red herrings. You just throw in a red herring, something they weren't expecting, and now there's a new novel problem for them to solve. So they've got to look for, what's the information they need to give the right perception or understand it, and then how they go about solving that problem from there.
Okay, fantastic. Now, in your paper, as I read through the introduction, you spoke a fair bit about, you set the foundation for talking about accuracy rates in law enforcement specifically. Yep. And so maybe can you talk about that? What did you find when you did your meta-analysis? What are we looking at for the average, or if there is even an average accuracy rate in officer involved shootings?
Yeah, so that was really difficult because there's not a lot of information available, and I don't know, like, yeah, I don't think the information is going to be collected that accurately anyway. But from what little bit I could find, it didn't really indicate that there was much transfer of training, really. So they were sort of recording it under two sort of processes. So one was, I think it was almost percentage hit rates. So that was just shots fired, shots hit type of thing. And then there was incident hit rates where it was more if one round struck a offender during that engagement. But then that was just a hit on a human body. So when you look at the training environment, and sort of from what I gather, a lot of organizations will sort of sit around that 80% mark. So 8 out of 10 rounds or whatever their magazine is capable of holding, 80% of those rounds need to hit sort of an A4 or an A3 or a specific size target. And it's usually paper or like a silhouette or something like that. So when you look at the transfer from that 80% to a hit on an individual, regardless of how many shots, like the transfer becomes really questionable. And then the accuracy does change a little bit. Obviously, distance is a big one, and you don't need to really explain that to anybody. Light conditions, whether the person was armed or unarmed is a big one, and I think that comes down to a lot of the response time, because the big things that I've sort of come across around the intensity of perceived threat is proximity, so how close the threat is, the magnitude of the threat, and time to response. And this is where firearms take away time and proximity. So, a pistol, depending on how well trained they are, anything from 10 to 20 meters or 10 to 20 yards, it's still a threat as edged weapon. Once you get beyond a certain distance, the threat dissipates quite quickly because you've got time to respond, where firearms take that away. Like long guns or rifles, any, depending again on the type and the skill, they could be anywhere up to, 1,000 yards or beyond. So they kind of changed that a little bit. So there were some factors around that sort of changed it a little bit. So it's hard to get really accurate data because you can't standardize use of force. But like when I looked at it, the hit rates were anywhere between sort of 12 and 28% for an armed offender or around there. An unarmed offender, I think, was around about 40% or sort of 30 to 40% hit rates. And then reality-based training, I don't remember the exact percentage, but I think it was around about anywhere from a 2 to 30% drop from their ranged-based accuracy. So there was a fair drop from reality-based, and then another drop to sort of unarmed. And when I use the term unarmed, it's not sort of inappropriate. It's just the way that those scenarios were going. And then there was sort of a huge reduction to actual force on force gunfight type of things. And then comparisons, I found some stuff that compared, I think, 19th century police officers and untrained offenders. And again, untrained offenders within certain countries probably isn't accurate, because I know there was a period there where certain gangs were sending people overseas to get combat experience, sort of thing. So some of them probably were moderately trained, but the percentages weren't really that different between the groups. So it's sort of indicating that there's been a lot of advances in our marksmanship and the training, but the question is, are we seeing that in performance?
Right. And it's interesting when you talked about the bullet hit rate, because I think, you bring up a good point, is even if some of my bullets in an officer involved shooting are hitting the subject, it still may not be effective combat fire, right? I mean, a lot of those rounds, if the officer who's engaging the threat has a weapon fixation or a weapon focus when they're discharging their weapon, and you've probably done all kinds of non-lethal training ammo, force on force stuff as a role player, and we always get shot. Those of us who are role players, we always get shot multiple times in the hand where we're holding the gun, the hand where we're holding the knife. And so you wouldn't look at that and say, oh, well, I got shot 4 times in the arm. That's good combat shooting. And so, I think even bullet hit rates can be misleading when it comes to the effectiveness of that fire, right?
Yeah, definitely. So you could get a bullet hit rate, which would be in the lower leg, and that's a long way from an A4 size target size in the center of mass. sort of thing. So like, and if you go into any scenario training facility, you'll see paint all over the walls, and like there's paint rounds everywhere. Um, and then one of the other things that did come up was, as the threat increased, the number of rounds fired increased as well. So, you've got this decreased accuracy and there's more rounds just flying around the suburbs or down streets, sort of thing. So the big thing is, where are these rounds going as well? So if they're not hitting the intended target, what are they hitting?
Right.
So like there was definitely some big reductions, but it's hard to be certain just because you can't standardize it. There's so many variables in there and you can't really get accurate data to analyze, but it did indicate that there's a real lack of transfer in marksmanship.
Right. Yeah. And so I guess that's the starting point for your study, right? Was confirming that there is a huge issue, there is a problem, there is a lack of transfer. And I'm just going to read one brief sentence from your paper here, Daniel. You said, if the evolution of training has only led to small changes in performance, then the challenge to the lack of transfer may lie in the cognitive factors and the threat response training more so than motor skill acquisition. And I highlighted that because I thought that was really profound, but maybe can you unpack that a little bit? What are you referring to there?
Yeah, so I did read some papers previously, and I think it was more so from sport, looking at, is it a motor skill breakdown or is it cognitive factors when it comes to performance in that environment? And it indicated that it's more so the cognitive factors. So when we think about marksmanship specifically, like we might go and somebody is extremely proficient on the range, like they've done a lot of range shooting, and we were using the term combat shooting, where I think it's kind of more just sports shooting because it just lacks so much of the contextual relevance to the operational environment. Like in military, you very rarely stand still in the open. Like it's just not a good move to do that, or you're not going to be there for long. Where on a range, you set yourself up in your stance, you get everything ready, the shoot you're about to do, you're ready to respond, like it's all there, it's all preempted, you're primed for that exact performance. Where we go out into the performance environment, it's often very rapid, it's something that you weren't anticipating, it just kind of evolves in front of you at an extremely fast rate. And then when it comes to sort of the response, and this is very time constrained situations, is that you don't really have enough time to take in all the information that's available. So if somebody comes around the corner with a firearm, I see that firearm, I'm likely to identify the firearm straight away. And then that's a massive threat cue that I need to respond to survive. So to survive, I have to sort of execute my action as rapidly as possible. So if I pause to wait to see whether there's any more information, and this is where you see a lot of blue on blues or sort of force on force, is if I start to then look for the uniform, look for certain insignia, look for all these other things, that's time I'm taking. And now my survival is at risk. I'm compromising my own survival. So when that, and this kind of goes back to that catastrophe theory a little bit, is that I'm at the edge of that cliff. If I cannot afford to wait for my own survival, so I have to respond straight away. So an avoidance-based explosive response would be to draw my firearm and fire, because that's the easiest way, or the most effective way I can avoid being shot or engaged. So what happens, or what sort of the indications are, is I'm going to shortcut that motor movement because I need to go from sort of response selection to execution as rapidly as possible. So the reaction times do come down. Some of the studies we looked at were significant, others not so much. But I think if it was under real life threat of death, you're going to see a significant reduction in that response time. Less likely to look at the foresights or the rear sights foresights and align them to the target, because I just need to get that shot away. So when you look at from a cognitive perspective, there's a lot less, or there's sort of more of an impact from that emotional cognitive impact than from motor skill, because I'm not executing the motor skill the same way I've been taught to do it on the range environment, because I have more time down there. So there's kind of, it's a combined effect, but driven more so by the emotion. So when I fire that shot, I just need to get that shot away and then kind of hope that that first one's effective. And this kind of comes back to some of my combat experience where involved in lethal use of force, it's more about trying to get behavior change on the other end And then you're sort of taking more deliberate sight pictures, these sort of things, because you just respond, you don't think about it. And I'm sure if you spoke to a number of police officers would say the same thing. And I know when they do some of their feedback, a lot of them don't report seeing the foresight, or they don't report really seeing a pistol. They need to respond as quickly as they can, sort of thing. So like, this is where your error rates, or there's a higher risk of misidentification, these sort of things, because you just don't have the time to take in more information or delay that response when you're under that level of threat.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. And, there are some studies that have been done even with eye trackers on police officers, where they put them in high stress, high fidelity force on force encounters with eye trackers. And to your point, that's exactly what they see, is especially at close, where they have no discretionary time, rapidly unfolding high threat encounters at close range. They are visually fixating on the threat when they present their weapon and pull their trigger. They're not really, especially the good performers, they're not wasting time trying to get their visual motor processes back on the sights. They're just driving that weapon forward and pressing the trigger as quickly as they can.
Yeah. And I think that kind of anecdotally supports some of the high repetition. So like, I've recently gone through some scenario training, and not once did I look at the sights, but I was still getting effective hits on target. But you're talking thousands and thousands of hours of training from my previous occupation. So I think there is a benefit for that repetition, because you can build some of those motor skills where you can align your weapon just from sheer the kinesthetic feedback and just that awareness that you have from it. But do you have time to do that many repetitions in an environment where you're performing and not training? Like the military world is a bit different, because it's such a training environment, where policing is a performance environment. So you have to sort of accelerate that learning process, because you don't have time for thousands and thousands of hours of repetition. But I think it sort of supports that you have to try and get that sort of optimal mix of what you've put into your training environment.
And that's where the title of your paper, I think, is really important, right? This idea of early contextual relevance, because in a lot of firearms training programs, is the vast majority of firearms training is linear training on a static firearms range. And then, at the very end of it, now we start to add on some contextually relevant, some representativeness. But I think, to your point, we just don't have time to develop the skills to that level. And so we need to change the way we think about training and bring in that contextual relevance early on, so that they can practice the technique within an environment, a motor skill, motor learning environment that's contextually relevant.
Yeah. I sort of say there's like an integrated training environment where you've got that emotional piece from the contextually relevant threat. So they're learning to deal with that increase in emotional response. You've got the cognitive information around the visual information they need to look for, the cues, these sort of things. And they need to be relevant, because there were a few things that fell out from the subsequent research that I did that indicated some of the cue utilization is very specific to the training environment. And there are features that just don't exist outside of that. And you can almost put in a response bias just through the way some of the training is done. And then that motor skill execution. So you need to integrate those sort of three important factors almost from the very beginning. And I think there's some really good research studies out there where they did reality-based training right from the start, and their outcomes were far superior than just range-based training, with no change in their range-based performance.
Right. Excellent. Very, very important concept. So when you undertook this study, so I'm just looking at the results here, you started, this is a meta-analysis. So you did a massive literature review. I can see that. You started with 7,692 studies that you retrieved, but you distilled that down to ultimately to 10 studies that were identified as part of with results relevant to marksmanship. So can you tell us, okay, let's talk about those 10 studies. We don't have to go through them all, but generally, what did those 10 studies show you? What was the findings of your meta-analysis?
Yeah, so the findings from that, and there were a lot of duplicates in there. So it went from 7,000 down to, I think, 3,500 quite quickly. But it's still a long process. So the results really, we're looking at marksmanship. So we're trying to find the articles where it had a similar sort of data analysis so that we could then put that into a meta-analysis. And I didn't do the meta-analysis, to be honest. One of the other co-authors did it because it sort of was above what I was moving at that time, or what I was capable of that time. So if you want specific questions on that, unfortunately, it's probably outside my understanding. But we're trying to find papers that had recorded their data on accuracy with enough similarity that you can then compare it. So there were, I think that's how we got down to the 10. And then we looked at years of experience within that data set just to see whether it was a factor within it. And it turns out that years of experience was, and that was kind of something that we anticipated, but it's just good to validate that or get the data to support that. And I think it was around about that sort of 12, 13 year mark where it showed that the increase in pressure from a range to reality-based training or opposed training, that sort of that response or the impact of that was mitigated by that level of experience. There were some studies within that where we did see some fluctuations, and it was more around sort of like your public order response or your higher trained individuals. The impact of reality-based training so going to reality-based training had less impact on them, where you sort of more general duties or your street officer, it was that sort of 10 years experience where just opposed training had less impact. But then when you think about that in terms of real world performance, like that 10 years isn't going to make a difference. You know, I mean, like they're just mitigating, I think it was on average a 14% reduction. And then when you think about the real world performance, I think it was around about that sort of 80 to 90% reduction, which is a huge drop off. So like you can bridge that gap a little bit, but you're never really going to get there. You can just improve your outcomes, I think. You know, and ultimately, if you can improve your outcomes, that's less rounds flying around the street, that's less inappropriate responses. You know, you're going to get far better improvements, which is pretty much all you can ask for, really. Less blue on blue or officer on officer type of thing. We then looked at reaction time, and I think it was only about 4 studies we could get that looked at reaction time. So it sort of wasn't a very big data set. And I think on average, it showed that there wasn't a significant difference between the range to reality-based training, but some of the individual studies did show significant results. But you know, when you pulled the 4 studies, it probably just wasn't enough power in that data to really get an outcome. Then we went on and looked at decision-making, and that was sort of shoot, don't shoot responses. So most of them just look at the amount of misidentifications or the number of errors of shooting a no-shoot target. And again, there wasn't a lot. Some of those studies within the study found significant differences. But again, I think just because of the data set, it was really hard to come to a really sort of robust conclusion on that. But it indicated under stress, decision-making is compromised. And then we looked at the interventions, which was the last piece that looked at within the meta-analysis. And that was mostly looking at reality-based training, sort of shoot back cannons using virtual simulators or video simulators. And this is prior to a lot of the augmented and virtual reality stuff that's come out in the last few years. And then there was some stuff around imagery and sort of mental imagery. Again, not a huge amount of research has gone into it. There's only a few studies that were used for sort of comparison. But what it did indicate is that the reality-based training, sort of opposed training, like what was sort of considered the high threat compared to a low threat range base, was able to give the same sort of improvements you'd expect to see after 10 years of experience. So I think it was about 1.1% improvement or a reduction in the impact of threat by about 1.1% for every year. And through early intervention of contextually relevant threat or reality-based training, sort of opposed training, early in training, gave about a 10-year performance improvement or mitigation. So that was the most effective. And I think that the imagery sort of showed some positive benefit, but not quite as much. But again, if you coupled those together, would you see a compounding effect, or would it just see the same sort of thing? So I think there's plenty of scope there to start looking at, you know, how do you integrate some of these intervention strategies for regulating emotion whilst you're under a contextually relevant threat.
Okay. So Daniel, when you say early, because you've said early contextual relevance several times now, and so I just want to be clear on what you mean by early. So give you an example. So if we have a firearms academy, or in the academy, our firearms program, let's say it's 120 hours. I think the average that I read recently was 128 hours is spent on firearms training in the average police academy. So what does early mean to you? Like, in the ideal world, if you, knowing what you know with your experience and your research, if you were going to come into an academy and adopt a firearms training program, at what point would you start implementing or integrating this representative design, this contextual relevance in firearms training?
For me, I think it would be at the dry firing stage when you initially have hold of that weapon and you're going through the actions, or here we call it sort of TOETs, which is test of employment type of thing, right from the very beginning. So for me, if you're going to fire that or engage that trigger or squeeze the trigger, you actually need something contextual to use it at. So for me, for my way of thinking, at no point would you actually pull the trigger without some sort of relative visual information in front of you. And early on, it may not need to be a threat as in any sort of consequence. It just needs to be relative visual information. And then you can slowly start stacking that on. And then I would probably look at using reality or opposed training before even going to a range, so that they're getting paint rounds shot back at them. And it doesn't need to be a hail of paint rounds being fired. And you don't want to overwhelm people. Maybe initially it's just somebody there that is capable of engaging. The brief that they're given indicates they're going to be engaged, but maybe they're not engaged. It's just the presence of that threat. And then depending on how they're responding, how they go from there, sort of thing. But one of the other factors is also within, and this is probably potentially more specific to countries like Australia, where firearms are just not in the community, is that people have this sort of not a fear, but the threat of actually firing live ammunition is their biggest threat. So, they need to be exposed to live firing. So how you want to make sure that you're integrating that in as well, so they become familiar with the weapon itself. Sort of thing. Where countries where everybody has firearms or a lot more people have fired, then it's probably less of a concern, sort of thing. But it's definitely a consideration. So how you build that, I think, would be dependent on the training staff you have at the facilities, what you've got access to, these sort of things. But I know, like, unfortunately, one of the limitations that I've come across is just the extra cost of using simunition is a barrier to its use. For me, like, if you've got people that are firing excess rounds through the suburbs, like, that's going to cost you something. So you're going to pay at some point. So why not pay for extra simunition rounds so you can avoid those sort of detrimental outcomes? So I don't know, it would depend on the resources, these sort of things, but I definitely would put it in early. And I know there was a specific paper that's in there, and I'm not sure how to actually pronounce the name of the author, sort of thing, but they used, so I'll speak to it it's not my research, but I'll speak to it very briefly, is that they had a range shoot at the beginning and then an opposed shoot, recorded their accuracy. One group did range only, the other group did opposed only, and then at the end they did a range shoot again and a opposed shoot. I think initially, and I could be wrong, but it was around, I think, about an 80% accuracy on the range maybe, and then 70% opposed, or maybe lower. The opposed training group then performed exactly the same under the opposed condition that they did on the range, and the range only group had the same drop in performance under the opposed training. So there was no benefit under threat, where the other group had the benefit under threat and still improved their motor skill acquisition at the same rate as the range only group. So I think so. The reference to that paper is in there if people want to go read it. I probably didn't do it a lot of justice in that brief explanation. But for me, that was one of the papers I read early, which indicated that just shooting on the range is probably suboptimal.
Okay, that's excellent. And so when you said you'd start them with a lot of initially with dry fire training, but you said with relevant visual information, is because here's a debate that I've been having with other firearms trainers in the last few months, is this whole idea of, is there even any role for the typical silhouette target, the blue man silhouette target in law enforcement? training. And the more that I read about the importance of what you've said, contextual relevance, that representativeness, the embedding of visually relevant information in all of the skill acquisition, I don't know why we would still be shooting. What would be the learning value in shooting at a silhouette target versus like a photorealistic target or something that has some visually relevant stimulus on it? What are your thoughts on that? Am I wrong?
No, for me, it has to be visually representative. Like you have to have the features present that they then would be expected to see in their performance environment. And some of the subsequent research I did, and it followed on some research that's previously been done on training scars, which was looking at people will go through, I'll use the term shoot house. I'm not too sure what everybody calls these sort of things, but where they do their live fire training indoors and sort of that close quarter battle type of scenarios, is that if that target has bullet holes in it previously, and even if they're obscuring where the weapon was or the image of that weapon, they're still being fired upon by a percentage of people, or it's significantly more likely they'll get fired upon because it's been previously shot. So now the question is, what information are they actually attending to inform that perception action coupling? And if it's bullet holes in a target, like you're not going to see that out in a performance environment. So visually, there's no transfer. I looked at it a little bit around simunition and seen very similar effects. And then looking at cue utilization, and I won't go into too much details because some of these studies are yet to be published, is they're very good at identifying information within a training environment, particularly threat or shoot-based information. But then when you add in more real-world information, there was limited, if not any significant improvement in their ability to identify those cues, and experience wasn't really a factor if they'd been in that training environment their whole career. So they're learning the training environment, or they're gaming the training environment. So this is where you sort of have to look at it, that people will only ever execute a response based off the information they've attended to or they've picked up to inform that perception of what it is and what it means. And if they don't have any out in the street, that becomes ambiguous. And under increased threat, ambiguous information is quickly classified as threat, or there's a higher risk of that being as threat. And then you'll see more of a sort of conditioned response almost to threat. And this is one of the other things I looked at reality-based training, was you need to make sure that you have a really good balance between kind of response and response inhibition, because you can condition or prime people almost for a response bias if your training is all just shoot targets or to that sort of effect. So I think understanding the principles is really important to help set up the training environment so you're getting the outcomes that you want, and enough of those sort of experiences to improve the response or perception action coupling that you want to see out on the street, if that makes sense to you. It's like, for me, it's a really, really big topic. You have to kind of understand what you want to see and then how you build your training environment to increase your chances of seeing that.
Right.
In the performance environment.
Right. Excellent. So, and that phrase you're using, performance action coupling, that's one that I've heard so much recently as I've dove deep into the waters of ecological dynamics and that whole nonlinear constraints-led approach to training. And for our listeners, after you've listened to this, if you want to find out more about what is perception action coupling and the importance of it, go back and listen to the interviews with Dr. Rob Gray from Arizona State University and read his books, How We Learn to Move and Learning to Optimize Movement, where he speaks very deeply about the importance of what Daniel's talking about, of keeping perception and action coupled with contextual relevance or representativeness from the real world. So, Daniel, I can't believe we're coming up on an hour already, but I want to give you the opportunity here, sir. You can give our listeners what are your top encouragements from this study? So firearms trainers that are listening, law enforcement trainers that are listening to this, what would your top encouragements be as takeaways from your paper?
I think it's just to take a look at the way people are doing their training, the way you're doing your training, more from like a curious approach to it. So look at, okay, what are we doing? What could we improve on, sort of thing? Because one of the big things when it comes to change and people become resistant to change is because they perceive that as a threat. So, like, and I've been in these discussions, and specifically around firearms and marksmanship and use of force, is that it becomes very emotional and people really attach to, like, it's their idea, they own it. So I think if you go in and you just got a more of a curious mindset around it, then you're more open to exploration as to what could improve things, what couldn't. And then just kind of look at, okay, well, what do we want to see in the performance environment, or what outcomes do we want? What are the principles that underlie that performance? And then look at, okay, well, how do we apply those principles rather than trying to replicate, a cool practice you've seen somewhere else? So then, because it may work in that environment, may not work in yours. And then kind of also have a look at all the stuff that's emerging now that can improve the way that you're applying your training. So when we talk about firing in the range, instead of just paper targetry, there's a number of advances in technology that can actually allow you to have relevant visual information projected against a wall, or augmented sort of thing, like augmented reality. Probably not that cost effective for everybody, but that stuff's going to become more feasible and more accessible in the future. But I know there's projectors out there. There's all sorts of things where you can start to implement that stuff early on. So just like, okay, well, everything has pros and cons. There's limitations to everything, but understanding, okay, where does this fit into my training? When do I do reality-based training? When do I do more visual-based training? Can you do video where you're just play, pause, getting people to understand cues? Play a bit of a video in a darkened room, pause it. Okay, how's everyone feel? Okay, just, have a sigh, give them a tool. Okay, what do you see? Okay, what other information is there? So you can start to integrate these different practices, or overlay or scaffolding these sort of different practices to build a very well integrated program. And some of that stuff can be done quite easily. So look at, what are you doing? What's going to work within the principles? Where do I put it in? And then sort of make sure that you're trying to deliver your training to get outcomes, not so much about what's easy for the organization or easy for the trainer to deliver, because that's another whole conversation, I think, around training that's delivered based on instructor ease, or, facilities or logistics, these sort of things. And that's limiting your outcomes as well.
That's fantastic. Great advice there, Daniel. Thank you. And I want to thank you again for making the time to come on to the Trainer's Bullpen. And more importantly, I want to thank you for your extensive service with the Special Air Service and how you've served your country and the community. And we wish you all the best of luck with your PhD as you continue on in that process. And we'll be excited to see the research that will come out of your lab and off your bench in the coming years as well.
Yeah, no, thanks. And it was a real honor to come on. So always happy to try and provide some sort of any value I can back into the community, law enforcement, emergency services, these sort of things. I think they often sort of get a pretty hard run, and not quite the resourcing and support they deserve. So more than happy. So I just submitted my thesis, so I'll wait to see how that goes over the next couple of months. So got that out of the way. Yeah, and my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
Absolutely.